All right, very excited to have Andrew Lowenthal here. He is the director of liber-net. Andrew, before we talk about liber-net and the big purpose picture going after what you guys are calling digital authoritarianism, let's talk about the Virality Project, because you have this investigation, and I should warn you, I forgot to warn you before we went live. Every once in a while I freeze. So feel free to take over my show if that happens, okay? I have
I'm
terrible
ready.
internet. All right, he's ready.
Thanks for having
Right.
me. Even more so if I take over your show.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here because this has been such a fascinating topic. I remember a couple years ago looking into the Stanford Observatory, but I had no clue how deep the connections went with the federal government and really the security state. So let's
Mhm.
start with the Virality Project. You all talk about, well, you know what? Why don't we just go over this map? Explain this to me first.
Mhm.
Federal government, election integrity partnership, and big tech. Let's start there.
Right. Well, so that is a image, I believe, from the House Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. So that's their diagram that essentially seeks to show the connections between the federal government, its sponsorship of the Election Integrity Partnership, which then became the Virality Project, and the connections to big tech. So one of the things that, I mean, there are many things into the Virality Project. Firstly, it was, just for context, it was a so-called anti-vaccine misinformation initiative that was run out of the Stanford Internet Observatory, but it was the kind of offspring of another initiative called the Election Integrity Project, of which the House Committee revealed there were emails, and I think Matt Taibbi found additional ones later in the Twitter files that make it very, very clear that that initiative was set up at the behest of the Department of Homeland Security. So there's an email from a guy called Graham Brookie, who is a leading figure in something called the Digital Forensics Research Lab, which is part of the Atlantic Council, which is essentially a NATO think tank that says, DHS, to the effect, I think if you scroll down, you can even see the exact quote, DHS has just contacted us to set up an election integrity partnership. So this initiative that was policing, firstly, so-called election misinformation, and then so-called anti-vaccine misinformation, actually was an initiative of the security state. Nowhere does the Stanford Internet Observatory say on their website that this was set up at the behest of, etc. Although they did have a senior officer, a senior person from CISA embedded as a fellow at the Stanford Internet Observatory at the time of both these initiatives, and he, a guy called Matt Masterson, co-authored two of their major reports on this initiative. There are also interns from the Stanford Internet Observatory placed inside CISA at the time. So you have this merger, might be one way to describe it, between the security state and academia. And of course, there were the other logos you see there are the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, Digital Forensics Research Lab, Atlantic Council, the one in the middle with the fingerprint, and another initiative called Graphica, which is kind of an advanced, does all the machine learning, kind of, Eye of Sauron type work to observe the internet around elections, around so-called vaccine misinformation, other things, lots of contracts from DARPA, US, other parts of the military-industrial complex, etc., which they also display proudly on their website at the same time as working with groups like Amnesty International. So this is the new mixed-up world that we have found ourselves in.
All right.
And so, just to add additional context, the last ones, the big tech, they had these big tech partners that were part of their JIRA system, essentially a ticketing system where they would log reports. Like, we found this, so-called anti-vaccine misinformation on this website. We want to alert you, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Pinterest, etc., who are part of this consortium, that this content is up there. In terms of the Election Integrity Partnership, they were very explicit, take this down type instructions in terms of the Virality Project tickets, which were released by this House Committee. They're a little bit more trigger shy, shall we say, but they sweep up all manner of things from freedom protests to people being upset that Krispy Kreme is offering free donuts for vaccination. This is apparently part of the policing effort of information online.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I was going to ask you in a second about how we make a transformation from election information to vaccine information, like where the connection is on that. Obviously, we see clamoring and hysteria about protecting democracy, and I'm guessing that underneath both of these, there's this urge to protect democracy via shutting down election information doesn't go along with their narrative, or vaccine information. But to some of us, that may seem like a stretch. I mean, what does elections have anything to do with vaccines? But Andrew, before we even get to that, can you explain to me how universities and colleges became a target for this? And why the Stanford Internet Observatory? Why the University of Washington? Why universities?
Well, I mean, in some ways, historically, if you think about the Cold War, universities were always a very big part of, had very strong links with the military-industrial complex and other agencies. So in some ways, it's not entirely new. What is new is this kind of laundering of content moderation or censorship through these what pretend to be research endeavors, but oftentimes are giving direct instructions to platforms on what they should consider misinformation, and to the point of like directly, this content should be taken down. In the case of the Election Integrity Partnership, so one is like, well, why? Well, it's not really a research project if you're making suggestions. I mean, why also can't Twitter and Facebook do this internally as well? Why does there need to be a kind of hub? But essentially, it seems like there's a hub between the government, in this case CISA and DHS, and the tech platforms that goes through academia and NGOs as a way to essentially, I would hypothesize, disguise the work of government censorship. And that essentially this is the way that the government says, well, we're not actually censoring here. These proxies in the middle makes it harder to see that what's going on, and it gives a certain amount of an alibi.
Could it possibly be because of the money in academics? The grant money they get from the government. You have the New York University, right, or University of Washington. I mean, these are, well, NYU I think is technically a private school, but University of Washington's a state school, and either way they get there's lots of grant money, government grant money that comes through for research and whatnot, and that's just a way to put the money somewhere, I guess, so somebody else could do the dirty work for you. What do you think about that? Is it just a financial ease of the project?
I mean, one of the risks, though, of doing it through state universities is that they can be FOIA'd. And this is actually one of the things that's tripped the University of Washington up a lot, is that they've got a lot of FOIA requests, to the point that I think there was a Washington Post and maybe even a New York Times piece, essentially where the lead researcher on a lot of this stuff there, Kate Starbird, was complaining she was being harassed because, she was being FOIA'd, which is actually just part of working in a public institution, that it's taxpayers' money, it's not your money. And so if the taxpayers want to know what you've done with their money, then they are entirely entitled to do that. I would imagine that would be considered a risk going forward, actually, because of the transparency that FOIAs enable. That said, it's much harder for the government to give out money directly to other outfits like the Stanford Internet. Well, it's not harder, sorry, but it then also leaves them open to FOIAs as well, if I understand the process correctly. Stanford Internet Observatory does take a small amount of government money, but most of their money comes from private philanthropy, people like Pierre Midyar, Craig Newmark, these kind of mega philanthropies, essentially, that seem to be some of the most proactive in terms of getting the kind of so-called anti-disinformation space up and running and scaled massively. So I don't think it's that. I think that they give a veneer of legitimacy. They can pretend that they're just studying this stuff and they're not actually kind of trying to do censorship work. There's an apparatus there and an infrastructure that can be utilized, and people can be kind of put into positions that are advantageous for certain people's agendas.
Okay, Andrew, think on your answer for a second about what is the connection between elections and vaccines while I get everybody drunk, okay? Just kidding. Don't get drunk, because it's a very important conversation. Wait until later for Valentine's Day. Wherever you're going for Valentine's Day, it's too late to get Allison. So that means whoever you're married to or dating or whatever is not going to be happy with you. So what you need to do is go to AllisonWinePromo.com, get your amazingly high extremist altitude wines, and then print out that you bought it and give it as the present tonight, okay? You can't go wrong. You get 50% off my favorite Malbecs, 50% off shipping. These are from small family farms, hand-picked grapes. Like I said, between 6,000 and 9,000 feet. You want to be an extremist. All your friends are being labeled an extremist. You just don't have the courage or really the energy at this point to get in the shower, get out of your grandma's basement, get out of those flannel pajamas. This is a great way to be an extremist and do basically nothing else but buy extreme altitude wine. And you get to support my work. 50% off again, the wines, and 50% off shipping. They've been a great sponsor of the show, and it's just a great product. So thanks to everybody over there. And if you're on Locals, you get to be on my editorial board for $5 a month and putting questions ahead of time for people like Andrew. Go one-on-one with the most censored people on the internet. You hate my questions. This is a great way to ask your own questions and ask whatever you want. So thanks everybody for putting questions ahead of time for Andrew. I also do have a P.O. box for those who like to do old school mail, probably one of the last places I'll ever be able to be reached at some point in the way the internet loves me and my show. P.O. Box 3355, Denellen, Florida 34432. Thanks everybody who sends cards. You want to send financial support. You want to send your pocket lint. Just nothing edible, because I'll throw it away thinking you're trying to murder me. And no creepy letters. Thank you. Okay, Andrew, what's the connection?
I mean, I think the connection is managing the narrative. Slightly crude way of saying it, but essentially, in some of the documents, they do talk about the vaccine stuff early on, before there even is a vaccine, whilst there is coronavirus as well. But essentially, as soon as there's the shift and the election is over, there are these emails in the Twitter files from the Stanford Internet Observatory where they email saying, now we're shifting across to this. So I think the relation is tenuous, essentially, and the relation predominantly is what does essentially kind of liberal elites or centrist elites, sometimes I think of them more as, in some ways, need in order to kind of maintain the programs that they want to be able to roll out and to minimize the resistance to them. Okay, so let's see if Allison comes back. In which case, I am taking over Allison's show, it would seem. So the one thing to do is to go and look at the Virality Project Twitter file, which is one that Matt Taibbi put out, that I did a lot of the research for, and maybe that's some of the context that I saw that Allison had put up on her on the page regarding my background. And maybe I can talk a little bit about that. So I came on to work on the Twitter files because Matt Taibbi put up essentially a job ad on his Substack, saying that he was finding all these NGOs and philanthropy, academia, and in the Twitter files. He didn't know very much about them. What was this? What's going on? He wants some help. My background was I ran a nonprofit, kind of did what we would call a digital rights nonprofit. I've totally taken over, Allison. It's going really well.
You're a champ. Yeah, you are a champ.
So my back. I was just been talking about my background, which was that I ran an NGO called Engage Media for almost 18 years. I handed that over a year and a half or so ago. I knew this world. I know this world of the academics, of the NGOs, of the philanthropists, and I saw names, and I kind of knew this a little bit beforehand, because I was getting very suspicious of the previous 2 years, particularly during COVID, that something was not quite right, that I'd been around anti-disinformation so-called initiatives over several years, had done a couple of them. I think they were kind of fairly mundane, but was kind of set off as I started kind of seeing very obvious things being called out as misinformation by these NGOs that you weren't allowed to talk about whether or not the virus may have come from a lab. Facebook censored it. My space was essentially this online freedom of expression advocacy network that was part of civil society from, again, the kind of left progressive space. And during COVID, as people got censored, yourself included, Alison, essentially no one did anything. They all kind of just stood there and kind of went, oh, well, I don't really know what's going on, or they're probably bad people, or they don't even notice that it was, no, a lot of them didn't even notice that it was happening. So you had this massive institutional failure from the organizations that were precisely there to actually protect us from this kind of government and corporate overreach. And you can say the same in terms of the kind of non-digital and more traditional civil liberties and human rights world as well. You had the ACLU come out saying, forced mandates are pro-civil liberties somehow. So this was the bizarre world that we began to inhabit, and the institutions set up to protect us from it mostly did nothing, or worse, in the case of the so-called anti-disinformation space, they became part of the problem. They worked with Twitter and Facebook and others to help with the censorship under the guise that people were spreading disinformation.
Can you tell everybody about how they can support you, where they can follow your work and all that good stuff? Again, director of liber-net.org. So you can go check them out there too.
Sure. So you can find me there. There's an announcement list, pretty low traffic that you can sign up to on that site. I run a Substack called networkaffects.substack.com where I publish my writing. I'm also occasionally published to Racket and Public, but generally cross posts across to Network Effects where I'm allowed to do that. So those would be the best two places to go and check out for now.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add before we go?
Thank you very much for having me. And I think the kind of, again, what I do find inspiring is the enormous amount of new media that is popping up. Like, again, it wasn't like this 5 years ago. I think the echo chamber that the kind of mainstream media has created, I think, is getting kind of more and more threatened by the absolute plethora of new initiatives that is coming up. And I think that's why this censorship, you don't censor when you are, in control and people are believing you, right? Censorship is actually a very, very high cost activity. Takes lots of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people, billions literally of dollars. And I think it's being done because they're actually in a very weak spot in terms of how they're trying to sell the future to people. So I think we can take heart from that.